Brace yourself.
Limbo is strange, but that kind of goes without saying. Despite all things surrounding it, Limbo doesn't give too many answers or even asks for them. It's a solemn title that's earned so much discussion over the years, where the constant theories and debates over the game's meaning has led to lasting acclaim for its developers and their carefully handed craft. Limbo is a hushed and ironically peaceful game whose disturbing, haunting world breathes solitude. And yeah, there's a place for a game like this, a story of traversing a void, striving for purpose and fulfillment. A story that needs to end, but ultimately doesn't, like the void it's named after. Limbo's fleeting strangeness, the condensed nature it displayed, was tough to ignore upon release. More condensed games were already beginning to find new life on digital platforms, and Limbo was no stranger to the mindset that powered these shorter, more experiential titles. It didn't take long for Limbo to make its mark, and while it's definitely lost some of that popularity over time, it's hard to erase a game like this from memory, one that's so dead set on making a statement not just on game's quality at the time, but on the developmental landscape of its era. Limbo was meant to shake things up and display a game that was shamelessly condensed and visually stylized. It was hard to look away from what was happening. It's been nearly a decade since this little project released on Xbox Live Arcade, defining Playdead as proud auteurs striving for artistic meaning behind familiar gameplay design principles. Limbo wasn't the first or last attempt to make a brief, atmospheric art house game that felt tailor-made for the growing downloadable circuit, but it certainly left its footprint. There's a remarkable sense of utility and purpose to Limbo's direction, and it all comes down to keeping those eyes open. Graphic design of this type is meant to display its artistic features first and foremost, and Limbo's aesthetic is, without question, its most noticeable attribute. Limbo managed to take its mesmerizing world design and create from it a unique sense of presence back in 2010. That defining mood was so potent and remains a striking focal point for this game. The soft, foggy lighting especially gives the backgrounds a surreal sense of depth and passage, broadening the scope of the world and, despite its 2D plane, showing the player just how vast this strange place actually is. But it's that unique silhouette art technique that really hits home. Silhouettes are a very interesting artistic direction because they preserve mystery while still being defined and stylized. The observer can't see everything about the object, but based on the object's shape, they can decipher a general idea of what the item is. When implemented in a way like Limbo does toward them, there's a clear sense of style at work, but without giving the player all of the answers. In this regard, it makes plenty of sense that a world bathed in haunting mystery would use an art direction that preserves that mystery. Literally shining the light on the hidden defeats Limbo's greatest narrative and artistic purpose. It doesn't make sense to do otherwise. In its penchant for the mysterious, the silhouette art direction of Limbo is stunning to say the least. A clear and defined vision that makes the player feel uneasy at every turn. And when hazards and enemies come into view, this uneasiness makes quite the hike. One of the first major set pieces of Limbo shows the limbs of the giant spider monster, raising up and striking down on the boy protagonist if he gets too close. It's a clear moment, showing that this world is full of danger despite its mesmerizing gloominess. The way the hostile villagers appear as silhouettes conceals their faces, leaving the player to assume what their motives are without confirmation, as if they are wearing masks. Are they attacking the boy out of bloodlust, or simply out of fear and self-defense? That's never fully detailed. So the player is left guessing, developing the world in their head but also clouding the context. These components are meant to make the world feel dangerous, or at the very least unknown, and as a result that projects an anxiety onto the player's psyche. It's meant to unsettle. But then there's the second purpose Limbo's art style fulfills, indicating mechanics toward the player, which interestingly enough performs the exact opposite of the first purpose. Where the silhouettes on the stylistic level keep the player guessing by preserving the mystery of an object's form, they also use their silhouette shape to show what an environmental item, hazard, or enemy can do, all for the benefit of the player. For example, early on the player discovers that crates can be pushed to reach other areas. Even without any color aside from the monochrome black and white, the box's square shape is a confident indicator of what it is. It doesn't need extra texture or patterns to show its purpose. Same with objects like the boat that the player drifts on or the bear traps they avoid. It's clear that they can be grabbed and moved solely on how they're shaped. To compensate for this even further, the boy reaches his arms out to show that the objects can be pulled or pushed. It's a simple but elegant way of signifying function to the player, and this artistic utility is broadened as the game progresses. Sharp-pointed spikes are intimidating hazards. Other human-like creatures populate a rundown village filled with traps while openly acting hostilely toward you. A giant crawling spider monster is a clear enemy, one that should be avoided when it's chasing you. Limbo's silhouette aesthetic is astonishingly good at conveyance, especially considering how minimalist its graphics are. The game is able to show the player what each component is intended to do while still keeping its presentation stylized. And the fact that Limbo does this, preserving anxious mystique while still displaying necessary context for the gameplay mechanics, is extremely important. You don't want to provide too much information for the player, or the eeriness of the graphics won't have as potent an effect. But you also don't want the graphics to conceal key gameplay components, because then the player would get frustrated from the lack of context. But Limbo pulls this off, very well in fact. It's a real rarity to see a game with such a prominent focus on atmospheric graphical style manage to complement its gameplay this well with that style. While it's certainly not the first to try this technique, it definitely proves to be one of the most successful examples of using art direction as a complement to both atmosphere and game design, even if these two purposes are meant to display very different results when in practice on their own. In order to fulfill these two purposes simultaneously, Limbo is extremely focused on observation. The advantage of this focus doubles as an opportunity for the player to revel in Limbo's atmosphere, just basking in the sheer otherworldliness of it all, while encouraging the player to stay aware of their surroundings, understanding what each silhouette could imply from a gameplay perspective. Because of this, Limbo is, for the most part, a pretty slow-paced game. Even in the more shocking and intense moments, it's strikingly contemplative and doesn't put too much on the player when it comes to progression. When you're given a room with various environmental gimmicks or even just a stretch of land to traverse, Limbo encourages caution over anything else, which fits perfectly into its aesthetics mood. This world is a limbo, a void, and I don't expect many people to walk into a void like this with open arms. Of course, Limbo does take some detours from this slow observational focus, and I can't help but feel these detours are misguided. The mind-controlling slugs are dangerously close to auto-scrolling, forcing the player to either think on the fly, or in most cases, arrange various items in incredibly rigid and procedural ways to fit the game's bill, and often after repeated failures. I've heard complaints before that Limbo is a difficult game, and honestly, I can see why someone would say that. However, when it comes to why Limbo is difficult, I have my reservations. Despite the boys' repeated deaths, the best puzzles are displayed quite fairly, because they capitalize on the gameplay's contemplative observational core. When the player has the opportunity to fully analyze the situation via the graphic design, the puzzles hit the bullseye. But when the game doesn't give you the breathing room to observe and internalize its mechanics, it really stunts the pacing and causes the set pieces to fit abnormally into the flow of the game. Limbo is at its best when the player isn't under pressure, when the most anxiety-inducing parts are caused by the looming, brooding atmosphere instead of some immediate introduction of a mechanic that the player is strictly forced to endure. Spending minutes setting up an intricate puzzle only to die because you had a single piece out of place is restrictive and formulaic. Really, Limbo's difficulty doesn't come down to figuring out the puzzles themselves, but setting up the procedure required to solve them under strict contextual rule sets. That's actually more fiendish than any spider monster could ever be. But observation permeates Limbo. The game wants the player to examine and revel in the surreal environment they explore, understand how those examinations can apply to their progression, and see what they can do to successfully overcome each challenge via that collected information. The design methodology is actually pretty common practice to games overall, but Limbo, comparatively, pulls this off in a unique way, using an art direction that complements both its presentation and its gameplay functions. Limbo's finest moments are ones of careful, hypnotic analysis over heart-pounding, high-intensity terror. Really, it's not an empowering game by any stretch. Instead, Limbo is a patient game, giving the player the space needed to discover a puzzle solution, along with the chance to bask in a dark, empty void, rich with eerie curiosity. From its first impression, it was destined to make its mark on the indie game climate of the 2010s. And to this day, it's still easy to get lost in its twisted but beautiful universe.